Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us today. I'm Yasmina Greco with O'Reilly Media, and I will be your host for today's webcast. Today, folks, we have Sarah Wachter-Boettcher, and she's going to talk to you about how to get unstuck, content strategy for the future. Sarah is an independent content strategist based in Lancaster, Pennsylvania, where she helps clients stop creating endless content and start building strategies that are sustainable, meaningful, and future-ready. She got this way after stints as a journalist, copywriter, and web writer, during which she became increasingly dissatisfied with the chaos typically found in web content projects. In 2008, Sarah launched the content strategy practice at her past agency, off Madison Avenue, and started working closely with IA and UX teams to build a better way forward. Sarah is the editor-in-chief for A List Apart magazine, where her writing has also appeared. She also contributes to the online magazine Contents and blogs sporadically on her personal site, sarahwb.com. Sarah is also the author of the best-selling Rosenfeld Media book, Content Everywhere. And folks, we are very excited to have her with us today to present this webcast for you all. A couple of announcements as we get things started. First, you'll want to open your group chat widget if you haven't already done so. This is where we can interact with each other during the event and where you can post your questions for Sarah. We find that our audience usually has a lot of good knowledge to share, so we encourage you all to chat freely during the event. However, if you have questions for Sarah, please preface them with a capital letter Q so we know that they're for her and we can make sure she sees it for Q&A. You can also open, move, and resize any of the other widgets. If you would like to tweet from the Twitter widget today, you might need to give it permission to access your account. It will automatically append the event's hashtag to your tweet so you don't have to. And today we have two hashtags, folks. First one is content strategy, all one word, or content everywhere, all one word. If you have any trouble during the event, please take a look at your help widget. If you continue to have problems, just post it in the group chat and one of our staff will help you right away. For choppy audio or stalled visuals, please try refreshing your window. And remember, the best thing you can do for a good audio stream is close any apps that could interfere. People always ask, so we'd like you to know we are recording today's webcast and we'll have the archive ready usually within 48 hours. And folks, at this time it is my pleasure to turn the program over to Sarah for her presentation. Hello, Sarah.
Hello, thank you, Yasmina. Hi, everybody. Thank you so much for coming today to hear this talk. As Yasmina mentioned, I just wrote a book called Content Everywhere, and as part of writing that book, one of the things that's happened is that I've been spending a lot of time at things like conferences and hearing lots of people give lots of different talks in the web industry. And as I've been doing that, one of the things that I've noticed is that I've started to hear a lot of people who aren't necessarily traditionally content people talking about content. Recently I was at Web Direction South, heard Mark Bolden give a great talk. He was talking a lot about response design, and he said, every client, in my experience, has a content problem. And so as a content strategist, as a person who's often the only one in the room who's talking about content, this is really exciting for me. It feels really great to hear that so many people are starting to realize that content is challenging them in terms of design and development. Content is causing them problems. I think it's been not just people like Mark Bolton, it's been people all over who are starting to deal with things like responsive design or mobile or apps, are starting to realize that they don't have their content all figured out. Recently, I read an article by a fellow named Chris Armstrong, who's again a designer, who started talking about some of the problems with dealing with content on small screens. And he said, in traditional media, canvas dimensions are a known constraint. With digital, however, the canvas is an unknown. We need to build on what we do know, content. So what he's really saying here is that when you're dealing with something like print, you know exactly how big the item is you're working with. Whether you're dealing with a poster or a brochure or whatever, you have specific dimensions that you can work with. But when you're dealing with the web, anytime you try to decide how large your canvas is in a number of pixels, you're just making an assumption, and that's probably not really true for a lot of the people who are going to view it because you don't know how big their screen is going to happen to be. So instead of saying that you're going to have a certain canvas size and then work inward in your design, he's saying, okay, start with the one known that you have, and the known that you have is your content, and it makes complete sense. But as we see people saying things like that, it starts to make me ask a question. The question is, how well do we actually know our content? Are the people who design and develop websites, are they actually prepared to design from the content out? So there's some good news there. And the good news is that that's really what content strategy is all about. So I'm sure a lot of you listening today consider yourself content strategists or well-versed in content strategy. Maybe it's a little bit newer for some of you. For those of you who it's newer for, I'll give you just a little bit of an overview of what I mean when I say content strategy. So content strategy is a broad umbrella discipline, I would say. It's a lot of different things, but really what it comes down to, and this is a definition from Christina Halverson and Melissa Rock's book, Content Strategy for the Web, 2nd edition. What they say is that content strategy defines how you're going to use content to meet goals and satisfy users' needs. It guides decisions about content throughout its life cycle, and it sets benchmarks against which to measure the success of your content. So content strategy is really what tells you what you're going to be publishing and why and how. And some of the pieces that go into content strategy are things like the content audit, which is understanding what we already have, so getting a sense of the content that already exists, what shape it's in, whether it's good or not, if it is on the right brand, if it needs to be updated, those kinds of questions. And content strategy also includes things like figuring out what you want to say and how you want to sound. So this is an example of a message architecture that Margot Blumstein has used for Moo.com. And so an example of the messaging and the tone here is cheeky, witty and fun, young without being childish. So it's having a strategic decision about what you want to sound like and why you want to sound like that. Other things that are included in kind of bigger picture content strategy is realistic plans for actually getting content done. So this is an example of a page table that Relly Annette Baker did, which basically defines what content is going to go on a given page of a website and why it's going to go there. So this is designed to help you make sure that you don't just have fluff out there, right, that it's content that's actually useful and usable. So content strategy has been a discipline that's really been growing in the past several years in terms of both prominence and in terms of, I think, adoption within organizations. And as that's been happening, it's been great being part of this field to see so many more strategic practices take place with our content. But one of the things I've been noticing that really got me writing the book and got me thinking about what we were doing with our content is that it's not that easy. It's not actually that easy to just say, okay, well, we have a core statement of our content strategy, and we have some voice and tone recommendations, and we have some page tables. It's actually still really hard. It's hard for things like this. When we're trying to go mobile and we have content that just straight isn't accessible on a mobile device, because the story you were trying to access could not be found on our mobile site. And at this point, what are your options? Your options are either to view the mobile homepage or to view the story on the full site, aka the desktop design site. And so we have content that just isn't ready to be accessible from a mobile device. We also have content that is accessible on mobile, but it's pretty broken. It was clearly designed in such a way that that design did not adapt to a smaller screen. So you try to view something on a smaller screen, and clearly nobody expected that to happen, and the result is impossible to read. It's impossible to use. We also have problems that aren't even necessarily mobile. We have other types of problems with getting our content wherever people actually need it. This was pulled out of Instapaper. I don't know how many of you have used Instapaper, but it's a service like Readability is another one, or Pocket is another one, that allows you to read content later. So it allows you to basically save a piece of content from the web to sort of a personal collection, so you can read it at a later time. The problem here is that Instapaper couldn't figure out what was actually content on this page. What this page was an article that was actually about a professor being interviewed, and it was a long, detailed piece that included a lot of content. Unfortunately, when that article was saved for later, all that was included was the title and the attribution, and all the rest of the content that you see Those are things like social media links and kind of sidebar information that is not actually the content. So Instapaper had a tough time figuring out what was important here, so they couldn't save that content. It wasn't able to travel along with it when it was being saved. And we see problems like that a lot with content that's not parsed well, content that isn't savable. We're also having lots of problems like this. I'm sure this has probably happened to some of you. This happened to me. This is actually something that happened to me recently. But it's pretty frustrating. I am married to a fellow who works at Franklin and Marshall College. He's a visiting professor there. We're there for a year. So pretty new to the area, pretty new to the campus, and he tells me to meet him on campus at the Philadelphia Writers' House. And I say, okay, no problem, I'll meet you there for some literary event like you do. So I leave the house, and I'm starting to walk, and I realize, oh, I forgot to look up where on campus it is. But no worries, right? I have an iPhone, and so I can look it up. It's no big deal. Small campus. So I'm walking to the event, and I'm looking it up. First I try Maps, but Maps had no idea where I was, so that wasn't going to work. So then I said, okay, well, I can just Google it. No big deal. So I Google F&M Writers House, and I immediately get the right search result. And I immediately click on that search result, thinking, okay, no problem, I found it. And where do I go? I don't go to that page. I go to the Franklin and Marshall College homepage. It's a mobile-optimized homepage, but it's not the content I was looking for. And in fact, the content I was looking for, I can't even figure out if or where it will be accessible from here. There's no way for me to figure out where to go. And so I end up walking to campus, wandering around for a little while until I find somebody to ask where the Writers' House is. So things like this, I think, happen more and more often because somebody was trying to make some decisions about what somebody would want on a mobile device. Somebody was trying to say, well, if you're on your mobile device, you're going to want to know what's happening on campus, see lots of events, calendar items. You're going to need to be able to report an emergency. You're going to need to be able to check your email. But the idea that I would maybe want to find a specific location on campus or just simply navigate to a page that I had found in a search result, nobody thought about that. So I was just unable to access the content I needed just because I was using that device. And then other things that are really challenging with our content, even launching a new homepage can be really difficult. So this is Microsoft.com's homepage, which they launched as a responsive site a few months ago now, I think probably end of 2012. And when they launched this responsive homepage, they literally just launched the homepage. There is nothing deeper than this that is responsive. And so you could immediately look at this and say, really, all you did was a homepage? Well, that's not a big deal, right? But in reality, this is actually pretty difficult for them. Nishant Kothari wrote a post about this. He worked at Microsoft at the time and had worked with a team that was working on this project. So he wrote a long post about how this all came together. And when I read that post, one of the things that struck me was the kind of work that they had to put in to make this possible. So he said, the Microsoft.com team built tools, guidelines, and processes to help localize everything from responsive images to responsive content into approximately 100 different markets. They adapted their CMS to allow content strategists to program content on the site. So on the one hand, you could look at this and say, well, all they did was a homepage. But on the other hand, you look at this and you say, oh, my God, they had to deal with responsive content for 100 different markets. They had to adapt their CMS. They had to retrain the content people who were going to be updating this page. This wasn't just a homepage. This was actually changing a tremendous amount of things about the way Microsoft.com worked. And I don't mean how it worked from a code perspective, but how it functioned in that organization. So in a lot of ways, I think that this is why mobile is such a problem. This is why our content is so difficult to deal with. It's not just because we haven't been thinking about it, because that's really starting to change. People are really starting to put content into their projects much, much, much earlier. The real problem is that we're trying to move forward. We're trying to adapt for mobile. We're trying to deal with this wide range of devices. We're trying to deal with people who are going to access our sites in all of these different circumstances. But a lot of times our content's just still stuck. Our content's not ready to come with us. And I think a lot of the reason that that happens, the reason that we're stuck, is that we treat our content like this. For years, we've said things like, just stick it up on the website. In fact, I bet you've probably heard somebody say that exact phrase more than once. So this is a picture of the chewing gum wall in Seattle, Washington, which is an actual wall where people stick their chewing gum. Pretty gross, I know. But I do think that that's what a lot of CMSs look like on the inside. Is somebody went and said, okay, I need to put up a page of content, and so I'll just take it, stick it up wherever I find a spot for it, and that's where it stays, right? That content is just there. It's just there in that one little blurb, stuck in that one little spot. And we do that because we're creating content like this. We have these content management systems that go, okay, you can put anything you want in, right? How many times have you heard this? You have a WYSIWYG editor, or what you see is what you get editor, so you can do anything you want with that content. But it's really a little bit like this. We're just putting all of our content into one big blob. And so that worked okay when we were thinking about things like this, right? We were dealing with these large screens, and we could deal with having this one big piece of content that goes onto this one large screen, and we thought that that worked all right. And we could say, okay, well, we can make it look exactly like we want in this format. So the problem, of course, arises because we're now dealing with things like this. And we try to do that, and that same content just doesn't fit. That content wasn't designed or laid out in a way that makes it make sense on a small screen. It's only making sense on a larger screen. So a lot of organizations are doing some of the things that I showed you a little bit earlier in the presentation, things like creating mobile sites that have a subset of their content available on them, right? But there's some problems with the approaches people have been using. And one of the problems is that it's not that we're suddenly going to have fewer devices. We're not going to suddenly only have to deal with a couple of devices again. It's only going to get worse because people are using more and more screens of all kinds of different shapes and sizes. And you start seeing connected devices that aren't necessarily even things we might think of as being, devices we use to go on the web. So things that aren't necessarily phones or tablets or laptops, but things like maybe a web-enabled refrigerator or web-enabled cars. And so the diversity of devices people are dealing with is already pretty great, and that's not going to change. So I think that a big challenge that we have with our content that we haven't fully dealt with yet is that we spend a lot of time trying to create more content to deal with this. We say, okay, well, let's make a mobile site, and we're going to have some new content that's just for the mobile site. So we're going to have more content, more content, more content. And at some point, and probably already, that doesn't really scale. You don't have enough people to handle it. You don't have enough time to deal with it. You can't manage it. You can't continue to publish that way. So I think what we need to be doing instead, and what I really want people to start thinking about, is how do we make our content do more for us? Instead of working ever harder to create content, how do we have content that works harder for us? How do we have content that's more ready to go the places it needs to go? So when you start talking about content that's flexible, content that can go lots of different places, people will oftentimes mention NPR, and it's a great example. So NPR, if you haven't seen this before, they have a model that they call COPE, create once, publish everywhere. And the way it works in very stripped down ways is basically like this. They have a centralized content management system, and that's where their editors enter content. That's where everything gets checked and proofread and all of that. And then from there, it's stored in a completely clean database, so there's no presentation information in there. It's just clean code. And that allows us to go out over an API. An API is essentially what's going to allow NPR's machines to talk to other machines and to trade content back and forth. So from that API, it goes to all the different websites and mobile sites and apps that NPR has, as well as to NPR's third-party partners, which is things like those member stations. So if you live in any specific city in the U.S., you would have your specific NPR station. So like WNYC that carries NPR content in the NYC market. So the result is that they have one piece of content that's entered one time that's available on all of these different types of devices. And not only are they available on the devices they've already designed for, but anytime NPR decides that it needs a new product, anytime NPR decides that they need to get their content into a new place, they already have this foundation to work from. They're not starting from scratch. They already have this API content that's just ready to go. And so it saves them a lot of time when they need to develop a new product. So when people talk about examples like NPR, they'll often say things like this. I've heard this a lot from people who are often working in kind of the mobile strategy area, people like Brad Frost. They talk about content like water. And they say that content needs to be able to flow wherever it needs to go. You want your content to be something that you can pour into an endless different variety of places. And it sounds really great, right? Having content like water sounds fantastic because you want that content to get anywhere it needs to be and just fill up whatever space that it has. The thing about content like water is that content doesn't do that. You can't just expect your content to flow. You have to prepare for it. So preparing to have content that flows, preparing for content that can go anywhere like NPR's COAT model takes a little bit of work. It doesn't look nearly as neat as saying content like water. Because what it actually looks like is this. This is NPR's COAT model. This is an actual diagram that they created. And boy, is it ugly, right? This is a lot of infrastructure. They have to go through a lot of steps to make sure that content is entered in a way and saved in a way and stored in a way and then sent out in a way that it can make it to all the different places it needs to go. And it's really important to remember that that infrastructure has to start with content. So what they've labeled a data entry layer, what that really is a bunch of editors and writers who are putting content into the system, making that content work. And so the kind of content they're putting into the system, it doesn't look like this. It's not one big chunk of content because that's not really going to fill lots of different spaces and be reconfigurable in lots of different ways. They need to be able to enter content a lot more like this. This is an example from a client that I used to work on, a state tourism agency where they had thousands and thousands of pages of content that we had to break down into their logical parts so that we could make it a little bit more flexible. So breaking content down according to all the little pieces that make it whole is what allows you to reconfigure it in ways that's going to make it more accessible on more devices. And it's this kind of work that has to happen before you can do something like build an API. And it's not just breaking content down into parts, it's also thinking about how your content connects. It's thinking about your content as a system and thinking about the different attributes that your content has and how attributes are shared. So this was, again, for that state tourism client. And one of the things we realized with them was that when people were visiting a place in Arizona, they tended to look for a city. They tended to kind of know which cities they wanted to go to. And they would say, I want to visit Sedona, or I want to visit Scottsdale. And so that ended up being sort of the central piece of our content. And all of the other kinds of content that we had were all really related to cities. Landmarks were located near cities, or events were happening in cities. And thinking of our content in this interconnected way allowed us to do a lot more things with it. So some of you, depending on your backgrounds, might be thinking that that's not necessarily something new. That's really just a database model, right? It's really just a connection of pieces of data and all of the different attributes that data has. And people have been doing that for a really long time. I certainly didn't make that part up. But I think it's a big difference in how we need to be thinking about our content is that it's easy to forget data is also content. I worked on another project several years ago now where we had a set of location points, so like data about a bunch of different store locations that we needed to create an interface for that we would allow people to manage. And this was for a really large brand. And so what had happened is that a CSV file of all the locations came over from the client, and the project manager took a look at it and said, okay, that looks fine. Sent that directly to the developer. The developer made an interface, and then somewhere down the line, I got to look at it because I was going to be the one who had to train the people and deal with the people who were going to be managing this. And I looked at this and I said, I don't know what these fields mean. Are we using these? What are these? Some of them, like kind, just didn't make that much sense to me. Others, like DSD, I had no idea what they were even talking about. And so what had happened is that developer had simply put in exactly what was in the CSV that was given to him. He hadn't done anything wrong, but he wasn't really armed with a lot of content information. He didn't really know what we were trying to do with that content, and he didn't really know how it would have to be managed. So he really wasn't in a position to make good decisions about how that content should be structured and stored. And at the time, and like I said, this was several years ago, it hadn't occurred to anybody that maybe they should ask me as the person who would be in charge of that content. This is when I really realized that so many of the problems we were having with our content were because those things were happening in such siloed ways. What we were getting was structure sometimes, but a lot of times that structure was arbitrary. The structure didn't necessarily fit what we needed to be able to communicate. So a huge piece of this, I think, is that we need to start thinking about the way we structure content in a very human way. It's not just about breaking things up into parts, it's molding things so that they make sense. Because we need content to be human, we need it to be relatable, we need it to be meaningful, and we need to understand what's important about it. And we need that to be reflected in the way that we store our content. Once we've thought about things in that way, then we can make so much more out of our content and ensure that its meaning stays intact even as it gets reconfigured. So I think that this really starts with revisiting our existing content, going back to things like content auditing, which a lot of content strategy folks have been doing for a long time, and thinking about it in maybe a little bit of a different light than you thought about it before. In addition to looking at things like the quality of content and whether it's up to date and if it's on brand, it's also really important to look for things like patterns. You're going to go to a large set of existing content and try to make sense of it and figure out how it can be made flexible for lots of different devices. Then you have to find the patterns in the content, the natural ways that that content kind of goes into categories, instead of just looking at everything as pages. The problem with looking at all of our content as just pages, which I call pages of content on the web pages all the time. It's not like it's a problem to use that term, but if all you ever think about is pages, what that sort of implies is that every page is the same, right? That every page is about the same as every other page, or that those are equivalent things. When in reality, not all content is the same, and not every page really means the same thing. So when you start looking at your content according to the patterns that it has, you can start building what I call content type. Types of content are just things that fit together, things that operate in the same way, have the same sorts of attributes. So content types can be a lot of different things, and it really depends on what you're doing. It depends on your industry. It depends on what you're publishing. It depends on your content strategy, of course. But you might have content types that are things like event listings or recipes or products or help modules, all kinds of different things. But what it's really saying is, what is this content? Can we quantify what this actually is? What am I looking at? Not just a page, but it's an article. And it's once we've done things like that we can really make our content a system. So like when I was talking about working with the state of Arizona and realizing the city was at the center of the system, it's being able to do things like that. So a content system is what's going to allow you to make your content work together in an interconnected way, and that's really what you need in order for people to be able to navigate it in lots of ways and be able to access it in lots of ways. That could be things like this. This is an example of a content model for something pretty simple like a recipe. Recipes are a great example because they so naturally break down into pieces. What it really is looking at one single type of content and thinking about what are the different attributes you need to have in that content. And that's based on what the content inherently has in it. So for a recipe, you can't really have a recipe without a name for it and instructions and ingredients, right? If you don't have that information, it's really not a recipe. But there might also be all these other attributes or elements that you need within that content in order to make that recipe useful to you, your users, or in order to make it reach your organizational goals. So maybe you have things like an image, teaser text, maybe include nutritional information. Some of those things might be more or less important depending on the kind of site you're working with. So on a health-focused site, nutritional info is probably more important than on a site that's really all about sort of celebrity chefs and making the recipes that Emerald makes, in which case imagery might be more important. So those kinds of priorities really have to come back from your strategy. But it's breaking down all those pieces that you have and then looking at how they fit together. How do those things come together into more of a system? So how do they connect to all of these other types of content that you have, which might be that a recipe for, say, chicken tikka masala has a primary ingredient in it of chicken, so there's a connection point there to your chicken information. Chicken tikka masala is a dish. You could have 5 recipes for chicken tikka masala that are all a little bit different, but that's only one dish. It's part of Indian cuisine, and you maybe even have menus for, hosting your own Indian dinner parties, for example, that goes along with other items like making your own naan. So you're thinking about your content not just as a page, but as a piece that's part of this larger system that all works together. And it's when you thought about your content in this way that you really start to have options with what you can do with it, that you can really start to make choices about content. And what I mean by that is that as you try to scale up the way that you are managing content, say, for mobile, as you try to have a larger amount of content that's ready for more devices, you're trying to get responsive design to work for a site that's maybe, a governmental site with thousands of pages of content, you can't really manage individually how every piece of content is going to look. You can't sit down and hand design how each page is going to reformat as screen size gets bigger or smaller. You have to do things in a systematic way, right? You have to make those decisions more automatically. And so when you have your content organized into pieces and parts, broken down and thought about in a system, it allows you to make rules with your content so that as you're making things happen automatically, you're making the right things happen automatically. And that can look like a lot of different things, but a couple examples are things like this. So if a recipe, so the content type, is in the app, the destination, then you would include something like ratings before the ingredients because, for example, you might know that ratings are really, really important to people who are trying to pick a recipe, and that in the app, that's the primary purpose of the app, is for the quick recipe choosing. And so the ratings that a recipe has received from users might be the most important thing, more important than anything else on the page. So it's when you have that kind of structure in your content that you're able to make these choices, that you're able to choose what displays before what is more important, if content should go somewhere or not go somewhere. It might also be a situation where you want to display pieces of content in some places without necessarily displaying all of it. So you might have a rule that says something like display the headline in the summary of the most recent article from the travel category. So maybe on the home page you want to be able to just extract that piece of information. A lot of times what you see happen with content when people are trying to extract parts of content up onto a home page or something like that is you see that they just have a limit placed on there, like the first 100 characters of content. And what you get is this truncated content. And I think Karen McGrain does this really well. She says truncation is not a content strategy. Having your content just arbitrarily break off into an ellipsis, so it's, you might get 3.5 words in and then it's ... isn't very useful because if it's not really important what that content says, if it doesn't matter how much that content is communicating, why is it even there? Instead, if you've broken your content into parts and you have that little summary piece, you can extract it really easily, and you know that the summary is saying exactly what you need it to say in exactly the place you need it to say it. So it's in this way that as we take our content that's organized in big blobs where we have tons of it, that's not necessarily well organized, and as we start breaking it down, thinking about what it really means, how it meets our goals, storing it in a way that's more modular, and then thinking about our content as a system, that we're going to be able to do so much more with it. So that's the easy part of this problem. That's a lot of work. That's a lot of manual time sorting through, the just masses of content that you might already have and figuring it all out and then making sense of what you're going to do about it. So while it's a lot of work, it's not the more challenging part. The more challenging part of this, I think, is that it's not just that our content is stuck. I think our content is stuck because in a lot of ways we are stuck. The people who are working on it are stuck. And I say that because I've been doing a lot of workshops and talking to a lot of clients about these issues. And when I do, I tend to hear a lot of the same things. I hear of problems that are about content. This is actually from a workshop I did a few months ago where people wrote down some of the challenges they're having. I hear things about content, like they have too much content, they need to rewrite things. But that's not all I hear. I also hear things like stakeholder expectations and organizational buy-in. I hear people problems, not just technical problems. And so as I've been working a lot on figuring out how to make sense of content for the future and how to make our content more of a flexible foundation we can work with, I keep on rubbing up against the same organizational challenges. So what I want to talk about next is 3 challenges for our organizations. Sorry about that. Some of these slides got a little wonky with the formatting when they converted. So 3 challenges for our organizations that I think are really going to be critical for us to try to solve if we want to do all of the stuff that we've been talking about with our content. And the first one that I think we have to combat is the mass production mentality. So the mass production mentality is like this. People keep on creating content the same way they always have, right? In these big WYSIWYG blogs. If any of you have not been familiar with the term WYSIWYG, it's the what you see is what you get editors that lots of content management systems have. And so people just keep on pushing out the same content and keep pushing out the same content because that's really what their job has been. And the problem we get is this. You get this WYSIWYG or WYSI WTF, which is where people might do things like turn all of the text on their page of content pink and put it in 64-point type and change all of the lettering to all caps because they're trying to communicate something in some way that they think is really important because they think it's fun to do it that way. And they're not necessarily paying attention to what happens with that content beyond the little screen that they're working within. So I think that this is a problem that a lot of us who work in content strategy can relate to, is that somebody who doesn't really understand the content management system and goes to town with the palette. So I think there's actually a deeper problem here, though. And I think the deeper problem that we need to be able to solve, the problem that's really hanging us up and keeping people from adapting in the way they need to and how they produce content, is that a lot of times people in content producing roles in organizations, people in like communications or marketing or PR departments, a lot of times they don't really see how their role is tied to business goals and vision. So they don't really see a reason that they need to change. It's very difficult to think that you need to operate in a new way if you don't understand what's important about what you're doing. If you know that your job is to put the press releases on the website, but you don't really understand how those press releases not being accessible to users is actually bad for the business, then why would you change? And so it's really this mentality that's like, that's not my job. I just need to keep this production line moving. I just need to keep on stamping out this content. So I think one of the primary jobs for people in content strategy, one of the primary things that we need to be thinking about doing, and this is true whether we are working in agencies or consultancies or inside organizations, is we need to be able to be the bridge. We need to be able to connect that gap, which oftentimes is a huge chasm between executive vision and daily execution. And that's not just for a project, that's not just one, but that's over time. So our jobs fundamentally cannot be successful unless we are helping people see the connecting points between the big picture, 5-year vision, what's happening in the company, and what's actually happening on the ground floor. If we're not doing that, we're never going to be able to really structure our content and make it flexible because we're always going to have the same problems with people on the front line who don't adopt it. The second challenge that I think we need to deal with is compartmentalized teams. So we see this a lot in organizations. We get people who are pretty siloed, right? We get departments that don't necessarily communicate with one another. And if they're worse, sometimes we get departments that are straight up hostile to one another. I bet that a lot of you can relate to this. I usually see a lot of people nodding when I talk about this problem. And that's that, IT just doesn't get it. I mean, in marketing, we understand this, or the other way around, right? It doesn't really matter what the different division is. Organizations have these dividing lines, and it's really difficult to break those down. you also get a lot of this behavior that's sort of like protect the fiefdom, right? You see this a lot, for example, in higher education, which I work with a lot, is that people are thinking a lot about their specific department, and they start really being protective of what's happening in their department. And so sometimes that causes them to want to fight with other people who are part of the same kingdom. I think a very notorious example of this is in government. The U.S. government is actually actively trying to combat this now, and they're really trying to adopt some of the content strategy principles that I've been talking about. But it's a big job because government has historically had a lot of different silos, and all of those silos doing lots of different things. Like, for example, if any of you happen to, I don't know, maybe have a student loan, maybe you've used this website. Or maybe you've also used this website, or this website, or this website, or maybe even this website. And actually there are, I believe, 14 different, last time I checked, federal websites that are all to do with student aid. And that's just a lot of information. And it can sometimes be really difficult to know where you would possibly go for what. And that's pretty duplicative, that's inefficient, that can't be good for government budget. But from a user perspective, that's simply confusing. It's very difficult for me to go in and know who I need to pay my money to, which I assume is what the government wants you to do with your student loans. I can't figure out which website to use. But I think that the deeper problem here is not just that departments aren't talking to one another. I think the deeper problem here that we need to be able to tackle is that departments that are focused on themselves are fundamentally not thinking about your customers. So if you're spending all of your time thinking about your department, your little fiefdom, how can you be thinking about your users and what they need? So I think this is an example of the underpants problem, which I think crops up in lots of different ways, especially when we're dealing with the web. But the underpants problem in this scenario is really that people start thinking that the way that they're organized internally needs to be the way they present themselves externally. So they're showing what should be an internal thing, their underpants, to the world and expecting the world to deal with them in those terms. So as the federal government has been trying to deal with this, they've done some research and they've done some discussions with stakeholders and users and had these national dialogues. And so one of the things that came out of that is that customers don't know and don't care to know how government is organized. So why make them go from agency website to get the full picture of what government has to offer on any subject? So when you start looking at things from your customers or your users' perspective, when you start focusing on what they need and what they want, all of a sudden operating in the silos starts to seem really silly. It seems really strange that you would send people to all of these different websites, but it only seems that way once you've stopped looking internally and started looking externally. So I think one of our big tasks is to help the organizations we work with and for be able to do that. We do that by starting to transcend some of those silos, by seeing what opportunities to create cross-discipline teams or cross-department teams. So what that is being able to pull together people who come from diverse places within an organization and get them focused on tackling a single issue. It's not necessarily having a meeting with the, say, head of every single department at the table. It's being able to pull together teams that are from different areas and different departments and getting them to not only work together on tackling a problem, but also empowering them so that they feel more excited and comfortable sharing those ideas as they go back to wherever it is that they came from. This is a way that change happens and kind of spreads through an organization over time. It's not a quick fix. Definitely, if you're going to pull people together from different departments and start getting them to work differently, that will take a while to trickle down to all the different places it needs to go. But it's a way that we can help get that started. And finally, I think the other challenge that organizations have that we should be focused on solving is their obsession with control. They want to be able to control everything. And you see things like this. You see organizations that are trying to work on a project, and they say things like, well, we have a text document with all the copy that will go on our 1,500-page site. We will need to build mock-ups of all 1,500 pages in Photoshop and update each of them every time there's the slightest text change in the Word document. Oh, that's sounds like a great way to streamline the workflow. So you see organizations say things that sound, when you really think about them, kind of crazy. Because what they want to be able to do is lock everything down. They want to see exactly what it's going to be like so that there are no questions. And so the problem is really they often don't get how digital stuff works. They don't really get the web, right? They want to see everything fixed in place. They want it to be locked down before they approve it because they won't want to approve something that might potentially change. And also, the idea of users controlling stuff terrifies them. This idea of users being able to take their content and do whatever they want with it is really scary because they feel like if it's out of their control, how are they going to ensure that it reflects them correctly? So I think that the deeper problem there, though, is that it's not just that they're trying to adapt for mobile, it's that they're just not built for change. And things are changing really fast. It's very scary to be in an organization and see things changing all around you and not know what to do. And so instead of trying to adapt, a lot of organizations, I think, are trying to just stop the ship, just stop things from moving. The problem with that, of course, is that things aren't going to stop moving, right? We have a web that is adapting very, very quickly. And the organizations that just try to lock everything down and stop everything, those organizations are going to really, really struggle in the future. And I mean that in the near